the only non-Jew in the entire Old Testament to be called the Anointed of God. The man the Greeks despised, but called great anyway. A document pressed into a clay cylinder 2,500 years ago, which the United Nations recognized as the first human rights document in history. A conqueror who did not destroy. A king who bowed to foreign gods. A victor who freed slaves. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire, liberator of Babylon. The Messiah of Jewish prophets. 127 nations under one rule. From Egypt to the borders of India. An empire that did not exist before him and that became the template for every great power that followed. Today we are going to investigate real sources, material evidence, and at the end, you will draw your own conclusion. If you find investigations like this fascinating, subscribe to the channel right now and leave a like. It takes 2 seconds, but genuinely helps us make more of these. And write in the comments, do you think Cyrus was a real historical figure or a constructed legend? We genuinely want to know what you think. But before we dive into the investigation, a brief note about method. What we are doing today is applying to ancient history the same criteria we would apply to any claim that demands to be taken seriously. What are the sources? How close are they to the events? Is there independent corroboration? Is there physical evidence? By these criteria, the story of Cyrus turns out to be far more complicated and far more interesting than it first appears. Let's start with the sources, because this is where the first serious problem appears, and it's a problem that most popular accounts of Cyrus quietly ignore. We have 3 main Greek authors who wrote about Cyrus. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote about him in the 5th century BC. Xenophon wrote an entire book about Cyrus called the Cyropedia, The Education of Cyrus. Ctesias, a personal physician to the Persian royal court, wrote a history of Persia called the Persica. 3 authors, 3 contemporaries by historical standards, and 3 fundamentally different versions of the same life. Herodotus describes the birth of Cyrus through a chain of prophecies and miraculous events. His grandfather, Astyages, king of the Medes, has a dream that from the womb of his daughter grows a vine that covers all of Asia. His seers interpret it as meaning her son will seize power. Astyages orders the infant killed. A servant gives the child to a herdsman. The boy grows up in poverty, unaware of his true identity. Then, his royal nature is accidentally revealed, and his rise to power begins. If this sounds familiar to you, it should. This is the same structure as the story of Moses, placed in the basket on the water. The same structure as the story of Romulus and Remus. The same structure as dozens of other foundation myths from different cultures about great figures. Scholars call this a myth theme, a basic narrative template that different cultures use to describe the birth of a great person. What does this mean for Cyrus? Either Herodotus faithfully recorded real oral traditions that had already accumulated legendary elements, or the birth story of Cyrus was constructed according to a ready-made template. Xenophon paints a completely different portrait. In his Cyropedia, which is a philosophical treatise, not a biography, Cyrus is wise, just, rational. He cares deeply for his soldiers. He builds a state on principles that Xenophon clearly borrowed from Greek philosophy. Xenophon was himself a student of Socrates, and his Cyrus is largely a projection of the ideal ruler in the Socratic tradition onto an Eastern king. The very title Cyropedia means Education of Cyrus. This is a didactic work, not a historical account. Ctesias, who had direct access to the Persian royal court and its archives, paints a third image. His Cyrus is harder, more pragmatic. Ctesias records versions of key events that directly contradict Herodotus. 3 sources, 3 different Cyruses, and crucially, None of them were contemporaries of Cyrus. All three wrote through generations or centuries after his death. So when someone tells you confidently what Cyrus was like as a person, ask them which source they are drawing on, because the answer changes everything. There is one more layer worth noting before we reach the material evidence. In addition to the three main Greek authors, we have Babylonian chronicles. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian official document written at the time, briefly and without embellishment describes the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus. No legends, no philosophy, just facts. He came, he won, he entered. This is independent confirmation, separate from the Greek tradition entirely, that Cyrus was a real ruler who performed real conquests. The Babylonians wrote about him not because they wanted to create a myth, but because they were maintaining an official record of their own history. But before you conclude that Cyrus is a myth, stop, because we have something far more powerful than Greek historians. We have material evidence. In 1879, a British archaeologist named Hormuzd Rassam was conducting excavations in Babylon. In the ruins of one of the temples, he found a clay cylinder 23 centimeters long, covered in Akkadian cuneiform, the Cyrus Cylinder. This artifact is today in the British Museum. It is written in the first person. In it, Cyrus says, "I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, mighty king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad." He describes his conquest of Babylon as peaceful. He says he returned the sacred statues of gods to their original cities, that he freed people from oppression, that he allowed every nation to live by its own laws. This is not a Greek retelling. This is not a Jewish interpretation. This is an official document produced under Cyrus himself in the language of Babylon, following the tradition of Babylonian royal inscriptions. Its authenticity has been confirmed by independent dating and linguistic analysis. Cyrus existed. This is not myth. This is history. But the cylinder itself raises its own question. It is written in the exact format of Babylonian royal inscriptions. The same form, the same formulas, the same style as the inscriptions of Babylonian kings before him. This means Cyrus used this document as a political tool to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the Babylonians. Was he telling the truth about his actions, or was this propaganda addressed to a conquered people? Most likely both, simultaneously. Real policy expressed in ideological packaging. Beyond the cylinder, there are inscriptions at Pasargadae, and it is worth pausing here to appreciate what we are dealing with. In the 19th century, when biblical stories began facing serious historical scrutiny, skeptics argued that the liberation of the Jews by Cyrus could be an invention or an exaggeration. The cylinder closed that question permanently. A Babylonian official document produced under Cyrus himself confirms precisely the policy described in the Book of Ezra, the return of peoples and the restoration of their religious centers. This is not legend. This is corroborating evidence from a completely independent source. Beyond the cylinder, there are inscriptions at Pasargadae, the first capital of the Persian Empire. On the door jambs there, a brief inscription still reads, "I am Cyrus, the Achaemenid king." Short and unadorned, in the Elamite language, not Persian and not Babylonian. This is a detail difficult to invent and unnecessary to invent. It is the mark of an owner on his own palace. And then there is the tomb. That modest, six-stepped structure at Pasargadae that Alexander the Great personally visited in 330 BC, 200 years after Cyrus died. According to the accounts of historians who accompanied Alexander, including Aristobulus, he found a sarcophagus with a body, gold ornaments, weapons, and an inscription. The inscription read, "Traveler, I am Cyrus, son of Cambyses, who gave the Persians their empire and ruled over Asia. Do not begrudge me this tomb." Alexander was so struck by the humility of those words that he ordered the tomb restored. It had been partially looted by then, and posted a permanent guard. The man who had conquered the entire known world knelt before the memory of the man who had done it first. Quick note: if you enjoy receiving stories like this every single day, follow our Telegram channel. The link is in the description below this video. Every day, we post about the most incredible mysteries of history and the universe. There is one aspect of the Cyrus story that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The sheer scale of what he accomplished in 30 years is almost incomprehensible. Before Cyrus, the known world was divided between roughly equal regional powers: the Median Empire, the Lydian Kingdom in western Anatolia, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and Egypt. In 3 decades, one man absorbed all of them. He defeated Astyages of Media. He defeated Croesus of Lydia, the richest man in the ancient world whose name became synonymous with wealth. He took Babylon without a battle. He extended his reach to the borders of India in the east. This is not gradual accumulation. This is a transformation of the political map so rapid it shocked everyone who witnessed it, including the Greeks who wrote about it generations later. Now, let's move to the most puzzling part of this entire story: the Jewish question. In the book of Isaiah, one of the central books of the Old Testament, there is a remarkable passage. God addresses someone named Cyrus and calls him Mashiach, the Anointed One, the same title that in Jewish tradition was applied only to legitimate kings of Israel from the line of David, the same root from which the word Messiah comes. The only time in the entire Old Testament this title is given to a non-Jew, and that non-Jew is Cyrus the Great. This is astonishing on its own, but there is a detail that transforms this into one of the sharpest debates in biblical scholarship. The book of Isaiah names Cyrus by name, apparently long before his birth, if you accept the traditional dating. If the prophet Isaiah was writing in the 8th century BC, and Cyrus was born and ruled in the 6th, that would be a prediction 150 to 200 years in advance. Believers take this as miraculous prophecy. Secular historians and the majority of modern biblical scholars hold a different view. They argue that what scholars call Second Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55 of the book, was written in the 6th century BC by an anonymous author either during or shortly after the time when Cyrus liberated the Jews from Babylonian captivity. In other words, the prophecy was being written as the prophecy was being fulfilled. This is not merely an academic debate. If the secular historians are right, then part of the book of Isaiah is a contemporary political text reflecting the real gratitude and wonder of freed Jews toward their benefactor, which makes the image of Cyrus in that text extraordinarily vivid and specific. A real king performed real actions, and real people whose lives he changed responded with the most elevated language they possessed. Why did Cyrus free the Jews and fund the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem? Here, 2 explanations converge without contradicting each other. The first is political. Returning deported peoples to their homelands with permission to rebuild their religious centers was Cyrus's standard policy, applied not only to Jews, but to Babylonians, Elamites, and other peoples. The Cylinder describes the return of divine statues to their original cities as a general principle. The Jews were one of many peoples who received their identity back. The second explanation is strategic. Loyal communities on the western borders of the empire were a strategic asset in confrontation with Egypt and Greece. A Jewish community in Judea created a buffer zone. This does not diminish the reality of the act, but it places it in context of smart, consistent policy rather than an isolated noble gesture. Now, the central mystery. The death of Cyrus. There is something almost poetic about the fact that we cannot agree on how Cyrus died. A man who spent his life creating consensus, who united 127 nations under one rule without the systematic terror his predecessors relied on, left behind not a single agreed account of his final moments. 3 separate traditions, 3 irreconcilable versions, each one revealing more about the culture that produced it than about the man himself. Herodotus writes that Cyrus died in battle against the Massagetæ, a nomadic people east of the Caspian Sea. The queen of the Massagetæ, Tomyris, after her victory, allegedly found the body of Cyrus, cut off his head, and plunged it into a bag of blood, saying, "You always thirsted for blood. Now drink your fill." This is one of the most memorable scenes in all of Herodotus. Xenophon describes a completely different death. In his version, Cyrus dies peacefully, in his bed, surrounded by his sons, delivering wise final words in the best traditions of Greek philosophy. He says farewell to his children. He reflects on the immortality of the soul. He dies as a philosopher, not as a warrior. Ctesias offers a third version. Cyrus died in battle, but under different circumstances and against a different enemy. 3 authors, 3 deaths, all 3 writing at roughly the same period. How do we explain such divergence? One explanation. Xenophon was creating a philosophical treatise and consciously gave the death of Cyrus the character of a philosophical end. Herodotus was recording oral traditions in which real events had accumulated legendary elements over the decades since they occurred. Ctesias drew on Persian court sources that contained their own version of events, serving the interests of Persian historiography. But here is what is not in doubt. The body of Cyrus was at Pasargadae. The tomb was real. Alexander saw it. This means that however Cyrus actually died, his body was returned and buried with royal honors. That itself speaks to the fact that there were political considerations serious enough to ensure a formal burial. Here is another dimension of this story that rarely gets discussed. How consciously did Cyrus manage his own image? The cylinder is written in the tradition of Babylonian royal inscriptions. This is not an accident. It is a deliberate choice of format designed for a Babylonian audience. In Jerusalem, he funded the rebuilding of the temple, deliberately creating an image as benefactor among the Jewish community. At Persepolis, inscriptions are in Persian. At Pasargadae, in Elamite. This is not a man who simply ruled. This is a man who understood the power of narrative and managed how he was perceived by different audiences simultaneously. In this sense, he was not merely a military genius and capable administrator. He was the first known practitioner of multicultural political communication in a multi-ethnic empire. Before delivering a verdict, there is one more question worth raising. Why does any of this matter? Why does it matter whether Cyrus was real or legendary? Whether his actions were altruistic or strategic? Whether the book of Isaiah was written before or after his reign? The answer is that the story of Cyrus is one of the most instructive case studies in how we construct historical knowledge. It shows us how a real person becomes transformed into a symbol, how different cultures take the same historical raw material and shape it to serve their own needs, how the line between history and mythology is not a clean dividing line, but a gradual spectrum, and how understanding that spectrum makes us more honest thinkers, not just about ancient history, but about every story we are told about great figures and decisive moments. So, was Cyrus a real person or a myth? The answer is this. Cyrus was a real person, beyond any doubt. A real king, real conquests, real documents, a real tomb that eyewitnesses visited. This is not myth. But around the real Cyrus, immediately after his life and perhaps during it, layers of legend began to form. Greeks used his image for philosophical treatises on the ideal ruler. Jews saw in him the fulfillment of prophecy and an instrument of God. Persian tradition created from him an image of a founding hero with a legendary birth and a wise death. Each culture took a real person and reconstructed him according to its own needs. This is the true story of great figures in history. They are real, but reality immediately begins to accumulate narrative. Because real actions are too significant to remain mere biographical facts, they become symbols, templates, arguments in the debate about what an ideal ruler should be. And here is the paradox. Precisely because Cyrus was real, precisely because he genuinely did release peoples, genuinely did not destroy temples, genuinely did treat conquered peoples differently than was the norm, precisely because of this, it was so easy to layer all these legends onto him. A fictional character could not have become simultaneously a Greek philosopher king, a Jewish messiah, a Persian national hero, and a symbol of human rights in the headquarters of the United Nations. To achieve that, you had to be real. And you had to do real things extraordinary enough that everyone could see in them whatever they most needed to see. The real Cyrus was a politician, a smart, cold, pragmatic politician who understood something his predecessors did not. Loyalty bought with respect costs less and lasts longer than loyalty bought with fear. He did not free slaves from altruism. He was building an empire on principles that worked better than the Assyrian model of deportation and terror. And these principles proved so effective and so unlike everything that came before him that 2,500 years later, we are still debating whether he was a man or something more. He was a man, and that is precisely what makes his story so extraordinary. Because if he had been a god, or a demigod, or simply a legend, his example would prove nothing. He would be a fairy tale. But he was a man, with real political calculations, real errors of judgment, a real death we still argue about. And yet, what he did was significant enough that 2,500 years later, his document stands in the headquarters of an organization representing every nation on Earth. A man. Just a man. But that is exactly why the word great still follows his name. He was a man. And that is precisely what makes his story so extraordinary. Write in the comments, what surprised you most today? The Jewish question? The 3 versions of his death? Or the fact that Alexander the Great wept at his tomb? Subscribe to the channel. Every week, investigations like this one. And follow our Telegram channel. The link is in the description below. Every day, incredible facts about the history of our world and universe that will change the way you see things. History is full of figures who were real people but became myths in their own lifetimes. What makes Cyrus unusual is the sheer range of traditions that claimed him simultaneously. Greek, Jewish, Persian, Babylonian, each culture found in him a different hero. That does not diminish him, it amplifies him. It tells us that whatever he actually did in those 30 years of conquest and governance, it was remarkable enough that completely different civilizations with completely different values all looked at the same man and saw something worth celebrating. That is not a small thing. That is the rarest kind of achievement. See you in the next episode.